All right.
All right.
We are live.
Are we live?
We are live.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good
But
morning.
participants are not in yet.
Huh?
Or are they? Mary, Tam, are people in yet? Up. It's climbing now. People are right now are joining us.
I could see the numbers. Yes.
Yes.
We'll wait for a few minutes.
We're taking a few minutes while people are joining us one by one. Welcome everybody, and thank you for your patience as everyone figures out the Zoom links and so forth.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. I am Professor Sebut David Aslanyan, the holder of the Richard Ovanesyan Chair of Modern Armenian History and the Professor of History here at UCLA. I am pleased to welcome you all to the inaugural Raymond Kevorkian Genocide Remembrance Day lecture to be delivered by the formidable Harry Harutoonian. This lecture was originally planned to be given in person last year, this time, in the relatively halcyonic days before the pandemic hit all of us. But we are delighted that Professor Harutoonian has agreed to join us via the electronically mediated forum of a Zoom webinar. Thanks to the IT support team at the Department of History, we are able to reach many more participants from around the world. Currently, there are well over 300 of you who have registered for this event, and the event is being recorded for future viewing on the website of the Richard Ovanesyan Chair of Modern Armenian History. Let me begin by telling you briefly about the somber occasion that brings all of us here together, and about the person in whose honor this lecture series is named. After my introductory remarks, I will invite my friend and colleague in the department, William Marody, who will formally introduce our illustrious speaker, who also was his own teacher. And Harry Harutoonian will speak for about half an hour, following which another colleague of mine, Professor Todd Presner, will join us to offer some comments on Dr. Harutoonian's talk. We will then field as many questions from the audience as time will permit. As many, but not all of you, may know, April is the cruelest month of the year, not only because T.S. Eliot once said so, but especially since it is the one time of the year when Armenians all around the world, whether in the diaspora or in the homeland, are united in a communitas of mourning, commemoration, and reflection upon the darkest period in their history when they had a close encounter with extinction. In exactly 2 days from now, on April the 24th, descendants of genocide survivors, as well as an increasing number of ethically upright Kurdish and Turkish citizens who have become aware of the atrocities committed by the Young Turk regime and increasingly frustrated by the repressive and denialist posture of the current government, will gather to commemorate the 106th anniversary of the 1915 genocide. Our lecture today is co-sponsored by the UCLA Department of History, the Luskin Center for Public Policy and History, the Armenian Studies Center, and the Promise Armenian Institute here at UCLA, as well as the Center for Near Eastern Studies, the Society for Armenian Studies, and the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. I am grateful to their respective directors or chairs, especially to my colleague and friend David Myers, Carla Pestana, Anne Karagosian, Bedros Dermatosian, Mark Mamigonian, as well as Katsuya Hirano, for their support in making this event possible. To commemorate this dark episode of Armenian history, the chair that I hold is honored to establish an annual Armenian Genocide Remembrance Lecture to be delivered by a distinguished scholar in April of each year. The lecture series is named after Raymond Harutoon Kevorkian in recognition of his many contributions to Armenian history, and especially for the transformative nature of his archivally grounded and rich studies that have set new foundations for the scholarship on the genocide of 1915, perpetrated by the Young Turk regime. Raymond H. Kevorkian is a French Armenian historian and one of the leading scholars of the Armenian genocide. He is a director of research emeritus at the Institut Français de Géopolitique and the president of the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute Foundation in Yerevan. Until his recent retirement, Dr. Kevorkian was the director of Paris's celebrated Bibliothèque Nubar, the Armenian library in Paris, where many genocide-related documents were preserved by the library's founder and first director, a genocide survivor himself, Aram Andonian. Referred to aptly by Donald Bloxham, a genocide scholar and a historian, as the, quote, Raoul Hilberg of Armenian genocide studies, unquote, Dr. Kevorkian is a prolific scholar and author of around 30 monographs and multiple articles. His scholarship has been dedicated to exploring different facets of the history of Ottoman Armenian society from the 17th to the 20th centuries, covering a broad spectrum of themes from early modern Armenian print history and book history to specialized studies of mass murder and violence in general and the Armenian genocide in particular. Kevorkian's work has been foundational to the modern scholarship of the Armenian and other genocides. His publications span from Les Arméniens dans l'Empire ottoman à la veille du génocide and l'extermination des déportés arméniens ottomans dans les camps de concentration de Syrie-Mésopotamie, la deuxième phase du génocide, to his monumental and relatively recently published The Armenian Genocide, A Complete History, over 1,000 pages in length. In addition to being a pioneer in the methodical use of Armenian language primary source documentation in the study of the genocide, Kevorkian was also the first to identify and study the second phase of the genocide, extending roughly from February to December of 1916. As a result of spending decades reading and assessing documentation left behind by survivors, Kevorkian was able to painstakingly reconstruct a network of concentration camps in Syria and Iraq that played a pivotal role in the Ottoman Empire's effort to eliminate its Armenian population. So now my UCLA colleague, William Marodi, will provide a formal introduction for our speaker. But first, let me note for those of you watching live that you have the opportunity to send us questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing in the question as concisely and relevantly as possible. Please be sure to be specific in your question, as well as being respectful and polite, of course. We anticipate that this lecture will take place around 30 minutes and that the discussant commentary will be another 10 to 15 minutes, after which we will have well over 45 or 50 minutes to entertain as many questions as are possible. And now it gives me pleasure to turn the webinar to Professor William Marodi of our Department of History at UCLA. let me say a couple of words about my friend Bill. Bill Marodi is Associate Professor of History and teaches modern Japanese history with an emphasis on everyday life and the cultural historical issues. He is also chair of the East Asian MA Interdepartmental Degree Program. Bill received his doctorate at the University of Chicago in 2001 under the expert guidance of Harry Harutoon. He is the author of the monograph Money, Trains, and Guillotines, subtitled Art and Revolution in the 1960s Japan, and numerous learned essays. I recall during one of our first encounters how excited I was upon learning from Bill that he had studied with such an important mentor, and that Harry was indeed working at the time on a memoir of sorts where he addressed his complicated relationship to Armenianness, the genocide, and the silence of his parents. Many years later, I am glad and honored, extremely honored, to host Harry at UCLA, even if via Zoom, and want to thank you, Bill, for making this auspicious event possible for us. Bill, I now invite you and turn over the podium in your able hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabu, for your kind words and for this opportunity. And it is my immense pleasure and humbling task to introduce my mentor and friend, Harry Harutoon. By any measure, Professor Harutoon's career has been one of extraordinary achievement as an absolutely transformative scholar and educator. Professor Harutoon began his intellectual career at another urban public university, Wayne State in Detroit, Michigan, where he roomed with Hayden White and Bernie Silverman, and what a room that must have been. After graduating in 1951, he went on to receive his doctorate in Japanese history at the University of Michigan in 1958, in a program whose contours had been shaped first by wartime and then by Cold War imperatives. In his work over more than 6 decades, Harutoon repeatedly draws attention to the conditions and stakes of historical work. Professor Harutoon is the Max Pilevsky Professor Emeritus of History and the College at the University of Chicago. His academic service stretches from the University of Rochester to decades at Chicago, to New York University as Professor of History and Director of the East Asian Studies Program. He also served as Dean of Humanities at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and as editor for the Journal of Asian Studies and co-editor of the influential interdisciplinary journal Critical Inquiry. He co-edits the broad-ranging Asia-Pacific series on culture, politics, and society for Duke University Press. Professor Harutoon's monographs in Japanese history, and this is all that'll fit in my hand at the moment, cover pivotal moments across the last 4 centuries. Each work represents an absolutely transformative intervention into historical debates. Harutoon's approach captures the productive dimensions of the texts he considers, the ways in which they embody new claims of knowledge and new demands upon their respective moments. He likewise reflects upon our own present as well, and the ways in which its assumptions and norms condition our historical understandings, taking what Theodor Adorno called doing the labor of the concept, and then examining its consequences for the possibilities of historical knowledge and limits. Or in Professor Harutoon's own words, quote, history, because its putative recovery or reconstruction occurs in practices that take place in the present, is ceaselessly mediated both by the nature of the present's changing political landscape and the forms of cultural expression that accompany it. Instead of endless quests for impossible historical recovery, Harutoon presents a history that matters for the possibilities in our present. His work asks us to consider the nature and conditions of knowing and to acknowledge the perpetual incompleteness of historical understanding and hence its perpetual productivity. Harutoon offers models of historical inquiry that challenge inadequate approaches, demonstrating the value of a properly conceived and reflexively aware analysis, one that conceives of both its historical object and its own present as conflictual, diverse, uneven, and inextricably intertwined. The past is always here, a dimension of the present itself. Throughout each moment of his own 60-plus years of scholarship, Harutoonian has rigorously interrogated dubious scholarly practices that were driven by Cold War imperatives and by resistance to claims from minoritized and decolonizing voices. His work has been foundational in transforming scholarship on Japan and beyond. But equally importantly, by putting this work into conversation with cutting-edge scholarly debates and bringing area studies out of its exoticizing isolation and nominalism, he has revealed the compelling relevance for these histories around the globe. By making such work answerable to broad debates considering modernity, comparability, time, nation, unevenness, everyday life, and fascism, Harutoonian's work makes grounded observations that often reveal limitations arising from provincialized assumptions. In opposition to such assumptions about leading and lagging nations, for example, his work demonstrates the fundamentally co-equal nature of human experience across the globe, where we are all part of the same conflictual present, even as his work highlights the specificities of struggles, inequalities, and power dynamics. Harutoonian brings the same dynamism to his teaching, pushing as many students, as well as fellow professionals, to ask, what are the stakes? To think of what is at stake in any historical situation, that is, and what the nature of our engagement with it might be. Here, too, he maintains the principle of equality, addressing students and colleagues alike as partners in an enterprise of consequential understanding. I could easily go on, but I'll just add my own immense gratitude for his mentorship, collegiality, boundless generosity, and friendship. Please join me virtually in welcoming Professor Harry Harutoonian.
Thanks, Bill. Can I start? Okay. Thanks, Bill. I had trouble recognizing myself in your over-the-top introduction, but I'm deeply grateful for you. I'd like to extend, right at the very beginning, my deep gratitude and thanks to Professor Sebu Aslanian, the Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History, as well as being a professor of history, the inaugural director of Armenian Studies of the Armenian Studies Center, Promise Armenian Institute of UCLA, for inviting me and giving me the privileged opportunity to share some of my thoughts about both the genocide and its effects upon my life, my long life, I should say. I also find I'm particularly pleased to give this talk within the framework of a lecture series named after Professor Raymond H. Kevorkian, whose works, not all of them, but the works that I have read by him have always impressed me as being really, at the highest level of scholarly standards. My thanks then to Bill, who has given us such a generous introduction and for his welcoming introduction, I should say. To Professor Todd Presner for providing a commentary, and indeed for all of those who participated in making this event possible today. Thank you so much. I'm going to read a rather short statement. And if there's time, I'd like to read some selected passage, but it's not necessary, only if there's enough time. I thought of this particular event, or at least the invitation, as actually an opportunity to kind of reflect on some additional thoughts that I've had on the writing of Unspoken as Heritage, especially its afterlife and the things that that I might have said in greater detail if I had the chance to do it all over again. So let me begin. Today is the 22nd of April. It's 2 days before the 24th, which marks the day of remembrance of the Armenian genocide. It started on what came to be known as Bloody Sunday in the Ottoman Turkish capital at the time of Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, in 1915, with the arrest of nearly 300 intellectuals, professional men, and notables who were considered leaders of the Armenian community. They were deported to holding centers near Ankara, which is the contemporary capital of Turkey, later relocated throughout the empire, and most ultimately murdered. The event was considered as a, quote, a decapitation strike designed to deprive the Armenian community of leadership and undermine the population's will to mount a resistance. But what appeared to be a modest beginning actually became a crazed attempt to annihilate an entire ethnic group within and outside of the empire, and finally rid Turkey of what it had regarded as its most reviled minority population. It was actually on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide that I began to compose the memoir of my parents' escape from Anatolia's killing fields, and their ultimate migration to the United States, where they settled in Detroit, Michigan, to encounter a second challenge of survival, which, if it didn't result in murder and mutilation, theft and dispossession carried out by the Turkish military and locally organized peasant mobs, it brought about economic deprivation and insecurity that still manages to kill the spirit. I had, and I repeat, no scholarly qualifications to write such a memoir. It was merely a personal thing, apart from imperfectly recalling their afterlives in Detroit. Because they never spoke of the genocide and left no written letters or documentary evidence, and only a few yellowed photographs, the memoir became what is called a recomposition. When I was growing up, I can't say we commemorated the day of April 24th, because this is my two sisters and myself, had no idea of what the genocide was. It was never really discussed or explained to us, and we never learned how our parents made it to the United States, why they came to to this country in the first place. Silence on an event that defined our parents' lives strangely discouraged any further curiosity and questioning related to what their lives were like before coming to the United States. I have no memory when I was a child of observing a commemorative dedicated to the genocidal event by my parents, or participating in any activity devoted to its remembrance, even after it was made an official date in the 1960s. I can only speak of my own family experience, but it still doesn't seem to me that the people my parents associated with in those years were any more mindful of the special importance of a day of commemoration. But it's probable that any decision to not commemorate a day of remembrance was consistent with remaining silent on the event itself. The very discipline of silence of our parents was replicated throughout the community to such a degree that among my cohort, I never remember even hearing a discussion about the massacres and murders until my late teens. As I grew older, I began to turn this puzzle of silence and bundle of fragments of overheard conversations at social events, Armenian social events, into a workable narrative with remembrance at the heart of the diaspora's life. It wasn't until my early teens that I learned we had come from a reviled race once designated for complete extinction. There was thus nothing in my upbringing to suggest that my parents, Ohanes and Vihanush, had once been forced to flee for their lives from the land of their birth. They never spoke of the genocide, nor did we ever hear the names of relatives who must have perished in the cataclysm. This silence, with the accompanying absence of names, created a void in our lives, which I write about in the memoir. And its greatest effect on all three of us is that it worked to inhibit us from asking questions concerning who they were, where they came from, and what their life was like in the old country. That's what used to refer to where the Anatolia as the old country. My father came from a large extended family of brothers, sisters, parents, grandparents, none of whom survived and have remained nameless to this day. My mother had a brother whose name I never learned, who was put into a Jesuit school at the same time to a German missionary in Marash as a measure of safekeeping. He died, but I don't know when and under what circumstances. Her biological father died when she was an infant, and her mother fled to Beirut after depositing her two children in foreign missionary orphanages and schools. She never returned to collect her son and daughter and started a new life. We never knew the names of grandparents on both sides, aunts, uncles, cousins. The few relatives my father had were, excepting a first cousin with whom he was raised, second and third cousins, not much with which to reconstruct a family tree, too many branches missing. The absence of close relatives meant not simply the reduction of important social relationships, but the diminishment of genuinely effective ties. In fact, I believed as a child that all of our lives began in Detroit. And as I look back upon those years, I'm convinced that their daily life before coming to the United States, a daily life which was, of course, severely shortened, was erased by their respective experiences that eclipsed their early years in Anatolia. For both our parents, the searing experience of loss in each case meant that the brief every day they had known vanished in what must have been a surge of blinding forgetfulness into an afterlife of silence, with our father's discovery of the disappearance of his entire family and our mother's realization as a child in her early teens that her mother would never return to her and had never intended to do so. But learning about why we were reviled because of our ethnicity and presumably religion, and thus subjected to an annihilating genocidal event by Turks and Kurds, doesn't necessarily register as actually knowing and understanding what all this meant. Nor did it occur to me that it involved my sisters and me. The enormity of such an event was too difficult to grasp for an ordinary American teenager, until I began to understand that all of these people we knew were survivors from some seismic catastrophe, lives that had been uprooted and shattered, and whose principal concerns were fastened to a remote history that happened long before I was born in a part of the world I couldn't identify on maps. This was not a willful ignorance on my part, but the result of a disciplined silence our parents pledged never to talk about. At the time, I would not have heard of the Judeo-cide, the American elimination of Native Americans and the expropriation of their lands, which Hollywood repetitiously but unintentionally recorded in innumerable ways, in innumerable bad Westerns, as if such theft, murder, and dispossession was a natural thing to do. I can't help thinking that as a generation addicted to Westerns, we unknowingly were being given such an education in genocide, that theft is a natural privilege of racial superiority against those who were both different and considered inferior. But I have since thought of the necessary obligation to teach children of such eventfulness to counter distorted representations that recklessly use both history and the law that result in undermining the credibility of both. And that we must make the effort to meet this obligation of doing so, because the Armenian genocide, like all genocide, genocidal murder, registers its occurrence on a world historical scale. When we teach the subject of genocidal murder wherever it takes place, we are teaching the young about a world that too often is localized to shrink its importance or make it appear remote, reduced to quantitative quibbling, how many people were killed, made unfamiliarly distant as not our affair, and as in the case of the Armenian genocide, frequently presented as a sideshow to what is considered a more significant event like World War I. Only later was I able to identify the necessary connection between instances of genocidal murder and colonial oppression. How colonization, according to the great French poet Aimé Césaire, inevitably leads to accumulating, and I'm quoting, the highest heap of corpses in history, end of quote. This bonding of colonialism with expropriation and dispossession impressed upon me the thought that there existed a kinship between the Armenian destruction of the American destruction of indigenous Native American life and the Turkish removal of Armenians from lands they had occupied since time immemorial and well before Turkic tribes stampeded out of Central Asia to claim the right to murder indigenous folk by virtue of conquering and degrading them into colonized status and serfdom, if not slavery itself in some instances. In fact, the consolidation of conquest, seizure, and capture opens the way to visualizing the kinship that gathers all genocides together to constitute a figure resembling a photographic negative of world history. Such a transmutation of Armenians to colonized status on their own historical lands thereafter destined them to endure lives of permanent humiliation, unscheduled expropriations, and an everydayness constantly filled with the psychological terrors of an unwanted necropolitics, never knowing from one day to the next whether tomorrow will ever come. When writing the memoir, it eventually occurred to me that by the avocation of empires, when writing the memoir, it eventually occurred to me that the avocation of empires, whether capitalist or not, pre-capitalist or not, and successor nation states driven by the lure of expanding capital accumulation, is not simply the quest for new markets and consumers, but also the commission of genocide. When Césaire accused Europe of ceaseless murder and dispossession in Africa, he rightly pointed out that in modern times, the theft and expropriation started in colonial regimes in Africa. I would add the Ottoman extermination of Armenians and other oppressed non-Muslim populations in Anatolia to this grotesque inventory. In the early 20th century, Turkey was still an empire trying desperately to transform itself into some form of capitalist political modernity. From the late 19th century on into the early decades of the 20th century, Ottoman Turkey entered the ranks of this moving genocide that started in Africa, turning Anatolia into an abattoir that reached its climax in the Holocaust of Central Europe less than 2 decades later. Genocide seemed to obey and thus follow the trajectory of a linear history leading to modernization, with the final realization of its own conception of progress crowning the exercise of total ethnic cleansing. What I mean by assigning the avocation or the term avocation of mass murder to the politics of imperial domination is manifest in the evolution of a logic that invariably leads to treating the conquered victim as animals and backward barriers to the achievement of progress promised by a modernizing program, making disposable the fungible labor of men and women whose lives have already been cut short by exploitation. Think of the Irish and Armenians who lived under oppressively colonial rule for centuries. Despite endless historiographic controversies over the causes that animated that animated such widespread murder, usually attributing it to religious and race hatred. It's really hard to distinguish between the two. At least I've had trouble with it. The disposition and theft was large enough to take notice of its subsequent relationship to the founding of the Turkish Republic. The real question that my gradual awareness of the genocide occurrence raised was its concealment by both the silence of our parents and by official Turkish denials that such an event had taken place. I have been convinced that the repetitious event to find more historical evidence is a transparent displacement and dodge. I've actually never believed that you can reduce an understanding or a final explanation of genocides through history, or historical documentation. If it seemed that these two responses were bonded in an unwanted symmetry, I would learn later that my parents' silence was prompted by their having survived the catastrophic ordeal at the cost of experiencing immense and unredeemable personal loss. For Turkish denial, it eventually became clear that this decision was overdetermined by a number of reasons. There was the fear that acknowledgement of having perpetrated the event would invite an avalanche of demands for reparations, which would further reverberate throughout the court of world opinion. Accepting responsibility for a catastrophe that not only eliminated 1.5 million lives or more in a very short period of time would demand owning up to the indescribable nature of the crimes committed, which along the way would especially stigmatize a leadership allegedly educated in the values of the Enlightenment. We only learn later from Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno that Enlightenment was constituted of a dangerously ambivalent dialectic between the possibility of emancipation and social domination and its destructive consequences. The decision to carry out mass exterminations defeated expectations for emancipation and reversed the course of progress into its horrifying opposite. While the theorization of post-coloniality in more recent days has contributed to sensitizing us to the effects of imperialism and colonial domination, it has inadvertently also worked to displace the denialism associated with colonization as the scene of genocidal activity by simply avoiding it. Rather than addressing the destructive outcome of massive material expropriations of the everyday lives of the colonized, it chose instead to divert attention to the cultural and psychological encounter between colonizer and colonized. This approach, already mediated by a post-colonial perspective of accumulated disappointment fostered by an educated elite, a disappointment with the new nation state, insisted on attending to the presence of subjectivity, worrying more about whether the subaltern can speak rather than eat, through a preoccupation with such categories like negotiation and reconciliation between colonizer and colonized as a recognition of the coming together of mutually shared subjectivities. This was a fantasy conjured in the afterlife perspective of the former colony, now a new nation, and the failure to see that imperial colonization was a license for expropriation, exploitation, mass disposition that made of the colony an archaeological site of primitive accumulation directed by colonizing powers, based precisely on excluding subjective recognition of the colonized. It should be remembered that these colonial empires were usually pre-capitalistic systems or those where capital had begun to make some inroads. Certainly, Turkey was no exception to this. When conditions worsened into outright genocidal exterminations, those who fled in fear of their lives ended up in societies that were entirely different political and economic environments like the United States. This was the life of my parents, this was the life my parents were compelled to live, and suggests that a generation of American historians and social scientists overstated the magic of assimilation by easily overlooking what migrants from these pre-capitalist colonies and societies would need to learn in order to secure some purchase on the complex process of adapting to a new life. It was an endless work in progress, punctuated by long stretches of economic insecurity for which they were totally unprepared, spending their years in trying to catch up with what they needed to know, and thereby teaching their children little, since they knew little to begin with. While writing the memoir, I came around to thinking that the genocidal experience is capable of being transmitted to those who didn't directly experience its threatening ferocity. Disclosing its unyielding aptitude for inflicting the sense of revilement on second and third generation offspring of the survivors who got out. I was persuaded that it also resulted in conferring upon the perpetrators even greater scorn for their hapless victims, because it was seen as unfinished business. For the perpetrators, denial simply expressed, as it still does, I believe, disappointment that the work of genocide remained an incomplete project that would find other means to get the job done. As inhabitants of conquest, the Armenians already were consigned to living a reviled existence, and for centuries always faced by the unwanted prospect of unscheduled assaults by marauders, tax collectors, and other privileged miscreants serving the empire. In this sense, the genocidal event was an enlargement and extension of the ceaseless expropriations, theft, and dispossessions that kept their everyday lives in the limbo of unsettled tension. As a result, the survivors who managed to get out would wear the scarlet letter of scorn and revilement wherever they dispersed throughout the globe to form the first diasporas. Before entering graduate school, I told my father, when he asked why I didn't want to study Armenian, that I didn't want to make the genocide a life's vocation. Years later, I was stirred into the belated recognition that I had all along betrayed an understanding of my parents' silence and embrace, their silence and embrace of the nameless, which had always been the indelible imprint of the genocide on my life. I think, do I have any time for reading selections? I didn't, or have I gone long enough?
You have time. Sabu, you're muted. Yes, yes, Harry, please.
Harry.
Am I muted? Am I muted?
No, I was muted. I'm done. I'm fine now.
Do you think I can read a selection or something?
Please do so, please.
Okay. I keep returning to the troubling problem of names, and that both Ohannes and Vihanush never uttered them, at least before us. I have felt that this decision may have been part of a strategy to close off discussion on things that they did not want to speak of. It effectively worked to foreclose any questions from us, since it is difficult to speak of nameless people we would never know and see. But it seems strange now, as already acknowledged, that none of us ever sought to open discussion concerning their early years. Was it because we were here and not there, which for us was nowhere, filled with questions never asked and answers deferred for a lifetime, and for our parents only, and for our parents only part of an aborted past that was cut short and taken from them? Whatever their intention, silence seemed to discourage further questioning and set up a permanent barrier against expressions of curiosity. I have never really managed to successfully explain the reasons for this absence of curiosity to others or to myself. My father mentioned only one of his many sisters by name, Catherine, apparently his favorite, who significantly died of pneumonia before the massacres, while the rest of the large family was murdered and their names never mentioned. If I recall correctly, I have often thought about the reasons why the names of the dead or those who have disappeared were never invoked, and speculated on whether there had been some deeply entrenched traditional practice that demanded the removal of such names in everyday conversation. Some writers have been seeing this absence as evidence of a broader, I quote, psychological trauma, a theorization that gained greater acceptance after World War II. In the interwar years after the genocide, apparently people were not encouraged to recount their experiences. It is not clear to me why such experiences were induced to remain untold. Thomas DeWall quotes from the published account recording the horror of Leon Sermelian's childhood and the loss of his parents. I'm quoting from that. Neither my brother nor my sister spoke about their most painful inner experiences, which, like myself, could not be told. In fact, I could not tell them anything about myself, nor did they question me. By a sort of silent agreement, we took care not to mention our parents and other relatives whom we dearly love. Their names or anything to remind us directly of them were barred from conversation, end of quote. While it is not conclusive that anything like some sort of communal fate or collective mass trauma explains this silence, it still must have been a widely observed individual disposition. In Sermelian's account, there is a similarity to our own later experience. A generation removed, to be sure, but when our parents remained silent on their relatives and names, and when we were thus barred from further questioning. If it is said to mark the behavior of survivors of different genocidal episodes, and I am not at all sure it does. Our silence is a reflection of a commonly shared reason that points to the unbearable pain of speaking the names of beloved relatives who have perished in a cataclysm. Striking out the names of the dead relatives and loved ones means that they no longer inhabit the everyday as we do. In fact, they no longer exist, but it also implies they are only remembered in silence and that their presence has been removed from the record of public memory as if they never existed. This may in part explain the consistent practice of never uttering the names of those who have perished, as if it were a way of quarantining the living from the dead. By contrast, the historical was all about names, usually names of the dead, who apparently still have stories to tell, fueled by it, attesting to the power of subjectivity to survive beyond death, preserving the names of the dead who apparently still have their stories for the living. One thing appears obvious: the extreme suppressing of the names of loved ones who perished is determined by the nature of the event that took their lives. If they did not die like Johannes' sister Catherine, who died of an illness, and whose name lived on in utterances, the names of those who were inhumanly and obscenely murdered are erased. For us, there is the additional question that asks for an explanation of the circumstances that prompted the three of us to agree to a compact of silence, as if there were no question to our acceptance that nothing ever really happened. Is it the same for those who experience an overwhelming natural disaster and have lost members of their families? What has interested me is the behavior of parents who refuse to refer to their parents and children by name and its effect on us. The refusal worked to prevent us from further inquiry. We were denied even the memory of belonging to a kin group of departed relatives. I have already reported that our mother mentioned none of the names of her smaller family, not even her mother, who survived in another country, much less friendships made in school and cemented by her journey to Greece. It came to me that perhaps her life with them was too brief, not worth recalling. not worth recalling through their names. Nor did my father mention his family's names, with the one exception. Here was a paradox. Not only did historians define the nameless for omitting from, not only did historians define the nameless by omitting from history the large numbers who sacrificed their lives to make history, but the survivors who were part of this historic cohort of nameless people redefined the category in order to also exclude their dead. In many ways, the silence of survivors like our mother is condensed in the act of namelessness, as if cutting out that portion of the past that no longer exists requires repressing names of people who once inhabited your world, but who actually disappeared with it. This whitening out of a portion of the past is, I suspect, a kind of preparation for a new life in a different place, or no life at all. It was strangely in keeping with America's own habitual allergy to history and forgetting the immediate past as if it never happened. I shall read, I think, one more. Is that okay? This is after giving accounts of where I try to portray the lives that I never knew, and what my father had mentioned. These accounts might have been an effort to portray a life that may never have existed, as he recalled it, a motionless image stranded in an indeterminate timelessness, and that he may well have dreamed up or embellished out of grief for what he had lost. I do not know. But like my mother, there was no apparent desire for him to return and no expression of permanent nostalgia for the disappearance of an everyday he would never know again. If there was, he kept it hidden to himself. Nostalgia for place was rarely an option for Armenians who survived the genocide, since it was still inhabited by Turks and Kurds, and the idea of returning to the scene of a cataclysmic crime would dampen any enthusiasm encouraged by impulses of longing and homesickness. He once reported to my oldest daughter upon a brief return to his village as a fighter with the Armenian brigades. These were a brigade that fought with the Russians against the Turks at the Russian-Turkish border in 1915 and 16. He returned to this very, he once reported, when he returned to the village, to find nothing left of his large extended family. They had all either been killed on the site or forced to join one of the many deportation columns. He never said, and perhaps he didn't know, but on his return to his village, he did remark, even the fruit trees had died, end of quote. I cannot help believing that this image of dead fruit trees served as a trope capable of standing in for the totality of destruction and death that remained with him until he died. Here, Ohannes confronted the most unanswerable question of his life, which was how and where his family vanished, murdered. This question would undoubtedly remain with him for the rest of his life and was comparable to Vihanush's childhood desire to know why her mother never came back for her. Answerability turned them into witnesses of silence, which they bequeathed to the three of us. I have often thought about why so little attention was paid to the countless lives that perished at the end of the deportation convoys, whether any systematic effort was ever made to account for the nameless piles of bones once embodied in living individuals strewn and entombed in the desert. I always questioned if he, Ohannes, knew, this is when I'm much older, knew or had a feeling of where and how his parents, grandparents, and siblings died. I have tried to imagine the scene of his return and entry into his village. Other members of his brigade must have accompanied him. I have been particularly concerned with how he must have reacted upon observing the quiet, dead silence of a familiar sight where he heard no voices and observed on entry empty homes, many destroyed, and of course, dying fruit trees. What were his thoughts at that time, and how did he incorporate the shock of recognition without falling apart? What had he anticipated, and when did he realize that his family had disappeared forever? And at what point did his acknowledgement of the aimlessness of the act pass into the formation of grief? His time in the dead village of his former life must have eventually forced upon him his decision to permanently leave the region and perhaps Anatolia once the war ended. It must have been in this circumstance that he began to formulate thoughts of returning to the United States. The scene imposes limits on my own capacity to imagine what he must have gone through, felt, and decided. To move beyond the obvious questions that ask themselves would be to fictionalize and violate a scene that has set its own limits of private hell for him alone. He never spoke of or described the scene to my sisters or me, only talking to my oldest daughter about the tragedy when she was a child. Her delayed recall of that conversation came years later. I have repeatedly asked myself, as I still do, why he never reported the episode to me or to my sisters. I am certain he never recovered from it, yet I have wondered whether he chose his granddaughter to momentarily release a lifetime of pent-up remorse and repression, condensed in a metaphor recalling dead fruit trees. Okay? I can't hear you.
You're muted.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Harry. This was really poignant, deeply moving, and penetrating and sharp. And I'm really, once again, humbled and thanks and grateful to you for taking the time to be here.
Thank you.
It now gives me pleasure to turn the webinar. Well, it now actually gives me pleasure to invite my colleague Todd Pressner to offer his comments on Harry's talk and book. Professor Pressner is chair of UCLA's Digital Humanities program and the Ross Professor of Germanic Studies and Germanic Languages and Comparative Literature. Since 2018, he is Associate Dean of Digital Innovation and in the Division of the Humanities and advisor in the Office for Research and Creative Activities. His scholarship on the Holocaust, memory, post-memory, and so forth is as broad-ranging as his kindness, generosity, and collegiality is profound. When I found out recently that our original discussant, Michael Rothberg, was unable to be present due to unforeseen circumstances, I reached out to Todd at the last minute, and he was very generous to accept the invitation. And so thank you, Todd, and I now welcome you to deliver your discussant comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Sidney, and thank you, Bill. Let me start by saying that I'm deeply humbled to offer words of commentary and response to Harry Harutoonian's talk and extraordinary book, The Unspoken as Heritage, the Armenian Genocide and its Unaccounted Lives. I come to the book as an American-born Jewish scholar of German and German-Jewish intellectual and cultural history. I study the Holocaust and its afterlives through forms of testimony, literature, and history. Let me start by briefly reflecting on what's now called Genocide Awareness Month, April being the calendrical commemoration of the anniversaries of a series of mass atrocities of the 20th century. April 24th, 1915, 106 years ago, marks the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. April of 1933 began with the Nazi boycott of Jewish-owned businesses and ended with the establishment of the Gestapo. Today, Yom HaShoah marks that anniversary. April 17th, 1975 commemorates the fall of Phnom Penh by the Khmer Rouge, which began the massacre of a million people in the next 4 years in Cambodia. April 7th, 1994 marks the start of 100 days of violence in which 800,000 Tutsi were killed in Rwanda. To be sure, To be aware or to raise awareness is much more than recounting dates and gathering data. This is something that Harutoonian's book makes eminently clear. Recounting numbers and recounting dates, this just provides an initial framework. It doesn't get at the everyday lives, the desires, the experiences, the memories of the people who these numbers reference or these dates call up. If we go a little further and think about the word aware, the Middle High German root, it's quite interesting. Bewahr connotes watchfulness, vigilance, and caution. It's connected with warning and admonition. That being aware also means looking out for something. In this sense, awareness is predicated on practical knowledge, maybe in the sense that Hayden White talked about it with the practical past. Perhaps what might be called an ethics of knowing, what we should or ought to know about what happened, because it's an ethical obligation so that we can be vigilant again. Hence, it would be unethical to look away or become complacent or unwatchful. This is knowledge that should inform how we act, behave, and treat one another. In this regard, again, I reference the notion of the practical past, the idea that the past can provide guidance and action, much more than just mere knowledge or facts. But if awareness, knowledge, and ethics go together, what does it mean when there are no witnesses, or when there isn't testimony, or when the inheritance, as Harry Harutoonian puts it, is silence? Or to put it another way, as the Armenian French philosopher and literary critic Mark Nishanian says, history needs facts, but, quote, the genocidal will wants to destroy the fact, the factuality of the fact. He argues that genocide is an event that denies itself and its belonging to history because it negates and denies its own factuality. Those quotes come from a work called The Historiographic Perversion. So how does it deny its own factuality? Well, let me just give one example, and that's the last law that the Nazis passed on February 16th, 1945, just a few months before May of 1945. The law goes like this. I'll read it in German and give a translation. Wenn der Abtransport von Achten, deren Gegenstand antijüdischer Tätigkeiten sind, nicht möglich ist, sind sie zu vernichten, damit sie nicht dem Feind in die Hände fallen. If it's not possible to remove the documents, in this sense, abtransport, to deport the documents that contain anti-Jewish activities, those documents are to be annihilated, vernichten, so that they don't fall into enemy hands. This is a law for the destruction of evidence, documents, actions, and ultimately the factuality of genocide. The last law that the Nazis passed was not to deport people, but to deport and destroy documents, abtransport and vernichten. Genocide, of course, is the annihilation of people, culture, and societies, but it's also the annihilation of the factuality. It opens up the possibility of denial. And this is, I think, the paradox that Nishanian is aiming at. We know that the term genocide was coined in 1944 by a Polish Jew by the name of Raphael Lemkin, who barely escaped the clutches of the Nazis and immigrated to the US. Lemkin writes in Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, by genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. It's intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. Now, while there are many words prior to 1944 to describe what was happening to the Jews in Europe under the Nazis, Vernichtung, Ausrottung, Shoah, Khurban, or in the 19-teens, the Armenians in Turkey, Henry Morgenthau used the word race murder. The New York Times covered it as extinction. Vernichtung, that very same word, destruction or annihilation. Ausrottung was the word used by Johannes Lepsius, a German Protestant missionary and activist. All this in the face of Germany's facilitation and even complicity with exterminatory violence. But the term genocide was not yet available. Henry Morgenthau, perhaps looking at trying to figure out a term that made sense, talked about a systematic attempt to uproot peaceful Armenians, arbitrary arrests, terrible tortures, wholesale expulsions, deportations. Maybe it was a struggle to invent concepts, but it was hardly a lack of awareness, and it was hardly a lack of knowledge. In his book and talk, Harutoonian reflects on the concept of genocide, which he connects with the long history of colonial and imperial violence, the quote, dispossession of a mass of people of their means of subsistence through expropriation, exploitation, mass dispossession, theft, and murder. Genocide, he argues, was a necessary instrument of carrying out the process of capitalism's primitive accumulation, directed by colonizing powers in the name of progress, wealth accumulation, and yoked to the recovery of an imagined racial purity. Decades of scholarship in post-colonial studies, comparative genocide studies, Holocaust studies, indigenous studies, critical race studies, African-American studies have sought to address what philosopher Miranda Fricker calls the epistemic or hermeneutical injustice, namely the injustice of not having concepts, of not having a framework for knowledge to describe and name events as such. But intertwined with epistemic injustice, and this I think is really central to Harry Harutoonian's book, is testimonial injustice. That's a kind of injustice in which survivors and perhaps their descendants are either not believed, not heard, not listened to, their stories are suppressed, and their experiences are not admitted into institutional forms of collective memory making. Hermeneutical injustice, not having concepts, is deeply connected with testimonial injustice, marginalizing or excluding the experience of the person capable of testifying. To come back to awareness, it's not just the ability to know and the capacity for vigilance, but also the willingness and openness to listen, to hear, and to do. Toward the end of his memoir, Harutoonian reflects on his decision to start writing his memoir during the centenary of the start of the Armenian genocide. He says that it was in 2015 that he, quote, actually made the effort to compose this memoir to praise all those nameless victims, men and women, who perished in the century's inaugural genocide episode. Embracing the nameless, as he says in the conclusion to his talk today, as an indelible imprint, formed the indelible imprint of the genocide on my life. Harutoonian's book, The Unspoken as Heritage, confronts testimonial injustice, why testimony is worth recalling. Perhaps as a whole, we might say the memoir could be considered within the genre of post-memory, a term that literary and Holocaust studies scholar Mariana Hirsch coined to describe the powerful and particular form of memory that's inherited. It's a kind of memory that characterizes the experience of those who grew up dominated by narratives of traumatic experiences that predated their birth, usually in reference to children of Holocaust survivors. But in the case of Harutoonian, there are no such narratives. He did not grow up dominated by these narratives of trauma, as many second and third generation Holocaust survivors did, but rather in silence. Here, post-memory is not the inheritance of, post-memory is not only the inheritance of repressed silence, nameless lives, and missing experiences, but it's also a process of recognition of what it means to grow up in the shadow of a seismic catastrophe. To paraphrase literary scholar Saidiya Hartman, what does it mean to live in the future created by genocide? To live in the future created by genocide. She says, what does it mean to live in the future created by slavery? Here, the general concept of genocide doesn't help us to resurface the everyday lives of the individual people who are abstractly referenced by a historical chronology of events, or a numerical accounting of the people killed, or the archival processing of documents that happen to survive. The subjective experiences, desires, words, imaginings, hopes, fears, feelings, and memories of everyday people remain unaccounted, vanished, extinguished. In his book, Harutoonian writes, and I quote, unanswerability turned them, his parents, into witnesses of silence, which they bequeathed to the three of us, he and his sisters. I was struck in chapter 3, Traces of the Vanished Everyday, by Harutoonian's invocation of the word never to characterize both his own working through the past and the finality of its loss. He writes that the experiences of his parents were never grasped, never questioned, never spoken, never recalled, never known, never reported, never recorded, never fully registered, never recovered, never referred, never asked, never surfaced, never mentioned, never said, never provided, never uttered, never described, and never able to be located on a map. It's as if, and he quotes, I quote again, as if they never existed, as if they never happened. Documentary history and institutional archives cannot help us here, because we're talking about, and I quote Harutoon again, the nameless masses denied entry into the historical record. Instead, he turns to what I would call the power of the subjunctive. It's the tense of possibility, the subjunctive. For Harutoonian, as well as authors such as Saidiya Hartman, I think Toni Morrison, perhaps W.G. Sebald, perhaps the poet Nobisi Phillips, the subjunctive opens up a space of imagination to confront the everyday lives of his parents and perhaps the many nameless victims unadmitted as of yet to history. Saidiya Hartman calls this work of narrative critical fabulation because it reckons with the precarious lives which are visible only in the moment of their disappearance. It's a narrative of what might have been or could have been. The subjunctive is about possibility, what might have been or could have been. As an imaginary recomposing of the memory of his parents' lives, Harutoonian writes, "It was necessary for me to assume the fictive figure of an uninvited intruder in their thoughts and try to probe and pry them loose from their silent confinement, or imagine what they might have been, where they had been deposited for so long," unquote. Further on, he wonders how to imagine and thus construct what their everyday lives must have been like before they were forcibly uprooted. He asks questions that can only be answered in the subjunctive tense. What would it have meant? I quote again, what would it have meant to his father to return when there was nothing left to a life he had once known, unquote. Possibility, hope, imaginative recomposition, perhaps critical fabulation, not what was, but what might have been. Perhaps we can talk more about this approach to narrativity in the discussion, but I'd like to conclude by quoting the final reflections in his memoir with a little bit of my explanatory interpolation. These are the last lines in his book. Harutoonian writes, quote, "After all these years, I still grieve the passing of my parents, but now for the lives they might have had. Osip Mandelstam, the great Russian Jewish poet killed by Stalin's Gulag, said it best when he said, and I quote, 'What tense do you live in? I want to live in the imperative of the future passive participle, in what ought to be.' The last part, living in the tense of what ought to be, possibility wed to ethics. Can one write in the tense of what ought to be? I think one can. Thank you."
Thank you so much, Todd. Really perceptive and very nuanced set of comments on a nuanced book and a nuanced presentation. So I'm really grateful to both of you. And now, before I open the floor to questions, which we will pose, Bill and I, to either Harry or also to Todd, if need be, then before that, let me say very quickly that when Professor Harutoonian was mentioning the book by Leon Surmeyan, I just suddenly it occurred to me that this is a book that I meant to bring up with you as well, Harry. We are actually using it. I'm using it from my classroom in the modern installment of Armenian history. And for those who don't know who Leon Surmeyan is, American Armenian writer, genocide survivor who actually taught English literature at Cal State Los Angeles, out of all the places, who wrote this famous memoir called I Ask You, Ladies and Gentlemen, which has just been reissued in its 3rd edition. So reading your book also made me think about Surmeyan. So now we have 45 minutes for questions. Bill, do you want to start? You want to kick off the questions with a question of your own?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So it's a little bit inchoate, but I'll try and get us going nonetheless. So Harry, you spoke about data accumulation as a kind of a displacement and a dodge against what in your book you write about as larger questions of memory and experience. But I was thinking too about your presentation of denialism as unfinished business. I thought that this was really broadly important today for the persistence of non-factual and counterfactual arguments in public discourse that I think do this very same thing, where they're not really making an argument. What they're doing is they're stating a willingness to be part of a community that's willing to do atrocities that they're not going to own up to. So that the denialism, as you were saying, this basically a commitment to finishing the unfinished business of this genocide is not just immune to facts, but is a statement that floats beyond actual public discourse. I was trying to think about the parallel between the ways in which an endless search for facticity in the face of this sort of both kind of fails to respond to it, but also is itself kind of manifesting the long shadow of this trauma and a deferral of accounting for memory. Can you say a little bit more about that relationship? Does that make any sense? Harry, you need to unmute, sorry. And I'll mute again.
Okay, all right. It's one of those afterthoughts or thoughts that I had, after writing the memoir. A lot of it had to do with reading subsequent material by people that knew what they were talking about, in the sense of what happens to Armenian, what happened to Armenian. It was not just, the interesting thing about it is that there were Armenians that remained in Anatolia, in Turkey after the genocide, and that becomes the basis to think about, in other words, their plight and what had happened and what continues to happen to them. In other words, to the present day. I mean, one of the things I pointed out that had not, people don't make much of is in his memoir. I mentioned it in the book, and what is it? Orhan's. What is his name? Orhan, the Turkish. Pardon me.
Orhan Pamuk.
Pamuk. In his book about Istanbul, in other words, his loving, there was Remembrance living there in the 1950s or being raised there in the 1950s. It didn't make any difference when he was raised there. There were still Armenians that were being killed, Armenians and Greeks that were still being killed in the city. And so you have to remember, this is not, and of course there was the spectacular assassination of the newspaper man, the intellectual and journalist Hrant Dink, where everybody came rushing into the street saying, we are Hrant Dink, which I've always found, perhaps one of the great expressions of disingenuousness that you can find in world history. But the business about finishing was it really goes back to that by beginning to discover, in other words, that the life that's led by Armenians, even down to the present day in these places, is still a life of revilement, basically. And that you have to balance that with something that people really never really get around to talking. I don't know the literature this well, but one of the things that occurred to me, and I think I raised it, I wondered what happened to all those people that were actively involved in the massacres. I mean, this is not just the Turkish military, which played a prominent role, but it was also, villagers, especially as these deportation marches passed villages, which was always an opportunity, in other words, for, theft, rape, forms of dispossession, expropriations, or whatever they had, where they were carrying, and you wonder what happens, what happens to what remains with these people of that particular episode, that particular experience. And I decided that probably nothing. Probably that that once it was done, they went on. They went back to, in other words, their own humdrum, routinized lives. And you have to wonder about a society, in other words, and that's you have to think about a society, in other words, that's capable of both committing, in other words, crimes of on the one end and forgetting about those crimes on the other. And I don't, and on this score, I hold the Germans as culpable as the Turkish inhabitants that involve themselves. I mean that we cannot grasp. I mean that's why there are such. It's impossible to grasp, for at least for me. I mean, maybe certainly smarter people than myself, in the sense that you cannot grasp the enormity, in other words, of such such crimes. I just can't do it. I mean, and I'm not talking just about numbers now. I'm just talking about there is a point at which this kind of arbitrary murder is in itself a crime. So, and yet people go on to live, in other words, normal lives after, those who were perhaps directly involved in it. And so that really opens the door to beginning to think about genocide as all. I mean, if I can use Professor Plesner's, really perceptive proposal concerning thinking in terms of the subjunctive, that opens up a kind of negative possibility, a possibility, in other words, which, if it wasn't done right the first time, it'll get done right the next time. And, and there is always that possibility that the next time will come. I mean, I'm sure that, I don't, it's one of the things that always, I don't just lay my cards on the table. I don't believe in forms of reconciliation. I never have, and I don't think I ever will, because I mean, reconciliation means, in other words, on the part of those, in other words, who committed the crimes, that somehow they've changed. And, we know enough about human nature that it doesn't easily change that quickly. And especially if there's no inducement to change it. And then certainly in the cases that we had before us, there hasn't been a necessary inducement. So that, it's I'm not sure this really speaks to you directly to your questions, but it's really what seemed to strike some sort of resonance with me, what I've said now, some sort of resonance with me. I should have been a little bit more, I suppose, direct when I was giving my presentation about what I meant by that. But I am convinced that, you already have instances of this taking place in Eastern Turkey, and with in Armenia, with Karabakh, the Artsakh, that in itself is an example. I mean, I'm of mixed feelings about that, because I have the sense that that there are people that were there probably shouldn't have been there, but that was a historic mistake made years ago. But it still brings to mind, in other words, the fact that Turkey itself was undoubtedly involved in that in ways that nobody really wants to talk about, in providing encouragement and support. And that's not only true of Turkey, but perhaps other societies as well. So yes, I mean, it's always a distinct possibility. I mean, I think that it's not a very comfortable thought. Because what I'm really saying is that nothing is ever resolved, either with genocides or with the ending of them.
Great. I was going to actually come back to you, Harry, to give you an opportunity to respond to Todd's comments, but I think you
I did know. I think he's absolutely right. I find that. I knew that. I mean, that was the mode that Mandelstam was using, and of course that but I didn't state it as subjective. But I mean, I have to say that I really learned a lot from that particular work, and I really learned a lot from listening to Todd's, I believe, really perceptive kind of reading of what I tried to do. Yes.
Great. Bill, you want to pose a couple of questions or a question from the audience?
Sure. Why don't I take Alina Avakian's question? She says that her family and she escaped Baku, Azerbaijan in 1988 due to the pogroms against Armenians. And she was just 4 years old. And so she doesn't remember it. But her parents remember it. And she says, much like Harry's parents, never talk about what happened or what they saw. So she's asking Harry if you have any recommendations on how to get them to talk about it or document what they experienced, since it's an important part of our collective history. Similarly to Turkey's continual denial of the Armenian genocide, the Azeris deny the violence and the large-scale ethnic cleansing against Armenians in 1988. And stories like my parents are important. Do you have some thoughts for her? You're muted again. I'll mute myself here. Sorry for the feedback that's happening periodically. Harry, can you unmute? And sorry. And you're good now.
That's a central question. I mean, I don't have really any strong advice because I was a failure. I mean, I failed, and it was only really when I was, an adult that even with some conversations with my father, especially my mother, never spoke of it. My mother had such an intense, dislike. I mean, she shut out everything. There was nothing about that area, that world that she wanted to have anything to do with. And I mentioned, of course, in the book, a brief conversation at dinner when I was, it was really right after World War II. And I mean, what I can remember of it, I mean, it was that, there were attempts on the part of the Soviets to repatriate, nationals from the various, from the various federated states of the Soviet Union, whether it was Ukraine or Georgia or Armenia. And there were a lot of Armenian families in Detroit, in other words, that went, but the discussion was whether or not, whether or not it would be an interesting idea. My father raised that issue. I don't think he really ever wanted to go, but he raised it and it really brought the house down, because she said, if you go, she says, you're going to go by yourself. And that was the end of the discussion. That's all there was to it. And there was no other discussion. And when I did try to raise some of these questions, I never was, and what I'm saying is that maybe it's necessary to raise these questions with people, in other words, who don't want these questions raised. My failure really, as it was with actually my sisters as well, was a failure to not raise these questions at a time when they could have been raised. I mean, when we were older, we could have raised those questions, and however uncomfortable they may have been, I think they were obliged actually to respond, but we didn't do it. And that's what I felt that was one of the really kind of, how should I put it, leitmotifs of the memoir. That's really at the heart of it, basically. I mean, it's about that. I refer, I'm like somewhere along the line. It's a compact of silence, but it's also a conspiracy of silence as well. And I'm not sure why I have any answers for that, so that I wouldn't be in a position to be able to answer somebody else's question as to how to go about doing it when I couldn't do it myself or didn't even think about doing it.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions that I'd like to curate from the audience. So the first question is from Helen Makhtumian, and she says, to build on your remarks today, in the Unspoken as Heritage, you assert, and she quotes, it is another mystery of the genocide why so many historical accounts have simply bypassed the the magnitude and significance of expropriated wealth connected to the mass murder on page 101. As a genre, your text is a memoir. Could you please elaborate on A, why it was important for you to include the chapter History's Interruption as part of your discourse on the afterlives of genocide, and B, how you hope to see critical scholarship take up the case you make for conceptualizing the logic of elimination in the Armenian case in terms of Marx's notions of primitive accumulation or original accumulation. Thank you very much for the lecture and the comments.
Thank you for asking the question. I have always had a strong feeling as an amateur, and from what little I've read, that much of the and I did make an effort to at least read a number of scholarly texts about the Armenian genocide, and I noticed that they follow a particular trajectory. I mean, it's not that. I mean, and that few of them, they do mention in some instances, the more recent ones do mention, in other words, certain kinds of economic, on the one hand, certain kinds of economic development in the Ottoman Empire, inroads of capitalism in the Ottoman Empire and development, the way it begins to penetrate into the countryside, the monetization of taxation and credit, and things of that nature. But and then it's in that context, of course, that some of these historians do to be complete, or to cover every all the bases. They do cover the fact that there was a lot of theft, and they also drag in the older kind of shibboleth or cliche that that Armenians were all wealthy, or there was a great deal of wealth. I have no idea of how much wealth there was among the Armenian community. I would imagine it was great among, the people that lived, the merchants and businessmen that lived, and families in Istanbul. But we're really talking about a population that is basically peasant. I mean, the majority of the population is basically peasant. And it's hard for me to imagine that they had very much, other than what they needed for their own subsistence. So that wealth, in other words, and that's of course the kind of wealth that marauders and raiders, and especially of the deportation columns, tried to lift. It's not made a lot of, and I think it's it follows a line, that maybe it's out of some sort of historical desire to cover all the bases. Let's put it that way. I think I've always felt that a lot of historical writing, in other words, sounds a little like the evening news, where they have to present, or public television, where they have to present always two sides of a story, as if there were only two sides. And my feeling about that is that they invariably cancel each other out, so you don't get much. There were a few people. I mentioned one, a French historian, I think Nichanian, not the elder, but the younger, who does actually use the term primitive accumulation. The Turkish historian, was his name? Akam. He doesn't mention the term, but he obviously mentions, that there was a great deal of theft, and there are. I mean, it's Nichanian that points out. I mean, this is where I got it from, because that there were, Turkish historians, recent Turkish historians, who have actually kind of calculated the amount of money, that was the amount of wealth, movable property, and so forth, that in fact was confiscated. And, a lot of it was used for, paying back debts, war debts, as well as undoubtedly for, as a kind of foundation, in other words, for the subsequent Turkish Republic. So that I find that, that it's too easy to fall back on, these, the religio, in the religious, what is it, the ethnic the problem. And the argument that I would make there is that it comes late. I mean, that is to say, if if it was always religious, there were just religious. I mean, I am doubting there were religious hatred. But you remember, Armenians and other Christian minorities were always at a disadvantage. They were constantly overtaxed and really heavily. I mean, basically, I mean, I can't go. But the point was that the idea that that there may have been real religious animosity, ethnic animosity. But after all, the Turks and the Armenians were there for, I mean, they were there 500 years. Why all of a sudden in the late 19th and early 20th century did they decide that becomes, in other words, an absolute imperative, in other words, in getting rid of or dealing with their minority populations who are Christians? It's not that it's not there, just that, that needs to be explained. I mean, because that could have been done any time in the long 5-century history of the relationships between, the Ottomans on the one hand and their Christian populations on the other. But it's that, so that it occurred to me that something that gets lost in this whole kind of historiography is taking a harder look, in other words, at the role played by accumulation. What comes after the genocide, in other words, is it's the end of the empire, but it's the beginning of the Turkish Republic. And there is nation states, in other words, and that's classic. That's really you get that out of Marx's Capital. It's classic, the relationship between the formation of a nation state and primitive accumulation. And I think that has happened. If you don't think it happened in the United States, it's exactly what the expansion west and the expropriation of those, of Native and Indian, lands, in other words, was really about. I mean, people don't want to call it what, they don't want to bring attention to that. And I think that part of it is that it sounds too much like one of those cliches out of the Cold War, that you have to be careful that you'll be accused of economic determinism, which is a code for being a communist. Well, you don't. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, our lives are determined by economics. I mean, ours especially. I mean, in that sense, we're born economic determinists. You don't have to be a Marxist to be an economic determinist, and I don't believe Marx was, actually. So yes, I think it's an important issue, and I think it's one that what I wanted. I mean, I don't have any particular expectation of the effect of that book on professional scholars of Ottoman history. I really don't. It's not. I'm not putting them down. I'm just saying is that I don't belong to that particular cohort. I don't. It's a professional group like the groups that I belong to. And it would be easy to discount anything I say because I don't have any particular authority. So to answer your question is that I didn't really have any really serious expectation of having that particular idea, becoming some part of a rethinking of the nature of the genocide, in other words, as a historical phenomenon. I mean, it would be nice if it would, or at least be taken into more serious consideration. But that had not been certainly not one of my expectations.
Sure. So Harry, I just wanted to point out that yes, the son of Mark Nishanyan, Mikhail Nishanyan, has written on this topic, but more recently there's been quite a bit of work in this area as well. Some of which is actually quite excellent. And one that comes to mind immediately is a co-authored work by two Turkish historians by the name of Mehmet Polatel, who was recently a fellow here at USC, and a friend of mine, Umit Ungur, called Confiscation and Destruction, the Young Turk Seizure of Armenian Properties. There's also a new book coming out, or has just come out through Harvard, by Umit Kurt, that also tackles this question. So there is a large body of scholarship that is increasingly addressing the economic nexus of the genocide. But the nationalism nexus should also, I believe, not be underestimated, because the number of scholars, Ruaran Sunni, and especially Michael Mann and others have pointed out that the emergence of a particular peculiar kind of nationalism late in the Ottoman Empire in the second half of the 19th century did play a very significant role in marking out the Armenians from elimination from this area. So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive.
I don't think they're exclusive at all, but they're presented as exclusive, and that was particularly my reading of Michael Mann. I mean, he's on a particular errand in that volume, and so that the economic, in other words, dimensions are in fact bracketed in ways that SUNY doesn't bracket him. He's covering everything basically, and that for me has its own defects, but that's another argument.
Okay, well, I have a question from an audience member who's an old friend and colleague from Michigan, Müge Göçek, who was involved in Armenian-Turkish reconciliation work in the 90s and late 90s, maybe early, mid-2000s. And she says, thank you very much for a most illuminating talk. The personal always gives us insights into what life was and was not like back then. In terms of the silence of the survivors, I found very useful the work of Eviatar Zerubbabel, who discusses in his Elephant in the Room, I assume that's a book by him, and also his ancestors and relatives, the significance of the family in the construction of identity in the latter case, and the importance of destruction of the moral fabric of society through silence. Thank you. Do you have any comments on that, Harry?
No, I can't say that I disagree with that. I don't know the works that are being mentioned here. The Elephant in the Room, does that deal with, is that a book that deals essentially with the Armenian question, or?
I actually am not familiar. The only work I know by Zerubbabel is a work on Passover and Easter and the role of time. So
I don't know that work, but there's nothing. Yes, of course, I would agree with what your colleague has to say. I mean, I can't elaborate upon it because it's not. I just don't have the kind of, as I say, access to information and I suppose examples that I could use, but basically it sounded right to me.
Okay, so much more down-to-earth, nuts and bolts kind of question is by Mary Errol from Turkey, who says that she missed part of the earlier part of your talk, but she was wondering where in Anatolia your parents were from and how they came to the US. Was it directly or via another country?
Well, that's a good question. I deal with part of it in the memoir. My mother came from a village outside of Marash, and she was deposited by her mother in a German missionary or orphanage school in Marash. My father came from a small village in southeastern Anatolia, which is near the city of, or in the vicinity of the city of Harput. And in other words, they both came out of a village environment, at least initially. As for the meeting, the problem of the meeting is really, I mean, my mother was, and many of the members of the, and I think they were mostly girls, young girls, all of them in their teens, were ultimately taken from the orphanage by their teachers, and some of their teachers were, were Armenian actually, and one particularly were taken by their teachers to Greece. Now I don't know when that happened. I have two. It could have happened. My guess is it happened probably after the when the war ended. I mean, I just it's hard for me to imagine because her mother had already put her into this school just before. Again, I don't have the dates of that, but my guess is it was a little before 1915. And she went to Greece, and again, I don't know how long she was there. She had never mentioned this to me. I mean, this is through my middle sister, who found out from somebody else that knew her, and they had discussed this. And she ultimately left Greece after, as I say, how long I don't know. She left Greece for Marseille, and that's where she married my father. Now that would have been in 1920. My father was by the time he had left the region, he must have left the region in around late 1916 and went back to he went through Russia, went back to the United States, and then joined the American Expeditionary Forces, and then was sent back to France, and where he was wounded. But he became an American citizen, and how they met, I don't know. I mean, I assumed or presumed that they met through. I mean, I don't know who the intermediaries were. I mean, I know. Let me put it this way: I know who the intermediaries may have been, but I don't know how this all came together. And ultimately got consummated in Marseille. The teacher that one of her teachers, and she was with whom she was obviously close with, was the person, as I say, not only took him with others, took him to Greece, but also must have been directly involved in some way or in other words of arranging the marriage itself, or bringing or serving as some kind of unofficial broker. I mean, my mother on this issue denied, at least to my older sister, that it was not an arranged marriage. I think that's not true. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that there would have been, they would have been someplace where they would have met and that had developed into some sort of affective relationship. I don't believe that for one moment. And she took the interesting thing about what she did was, I had for long years, until only just a few years while I was working on the memoir, that I discovered that she changed her name. She took the name of the teacher, Bedrosian. And this, for obvious reasons, there were a couple of reasons. One is that she could, it had something to do with getting her into the United States, but I think it also had something to do with the fact that, she had this really non-relationship with her biological mother. I mean, after all, her mother was in Beirut. She had started an entirely new life. And it was, her real name was Kupalia, which that, as I say, was something I hadn't heard until just a few years ago. And so they married. She suffered from what is it? The eye. It was an eye disease, trachoma, I think, and so it was at the time a particularly contagious disease, and it was that had it couldn't get into the United States. So they went through Canada. That's about all I know, and ultimately ended up in Detroit. She acquired citizenship. I don't know if she acquired citizenship because my father was a citizen, or whether or not she ultimately, took out citizenship years later. It's not clear. But that was right. And as for the teacher, I did, as I mentioned this briefly, the teacher, Bedrosian, and her husband, I don't remember his first name, had a farm outside of Detroit, not far from where the Detroit Metropolitan Airport is now. And I remember visiting there with my parents and my sisters a couple of times only, and but never really had. I don't really have any real memory of either of them, as and I was really, really too young. I think it was about eight or nine or something like that. I just don't remember. But that's how it happened, and basically. That's how they came together, and that's how they got to the United States.
Okay. Bill, you want to segue?
Sure. I think actually the detail that you included about your mother's name change might speak to an earlier question by Tibby Brooks, who was trying to conceptualize the discrimination faced in the United States by survivors of the Judeocide, the Holocaust, and wondering about comparable experiences among the Armenians. But there's a different question that a couple people have posed, Anne Karagosian and Gregory Jindanian both ask about DNA evidence in the sense of providing some sort of detail that gets past both the silences and the evidence obliterations. And does that add anything or what? Hang on a second, waiting for you to unmute.
I don't understand how, discovering the DNA of my parents or my sisters and myself, or
I think they're asking about the DNA of, for example, all the kids who were put up in orphanages and dispersed and lost, and sort of as things like that as traces of lineages that have been obliterated or forgotten, or just a trace of that explosion.
Well,
that's silent.
I get that. No, I don't. The only person that's interested in that question that I know of is my youngest daughter, and she has made it her a kind of avocation, I should say, or hobby, in other words, to inquire into all of these ancestral, in other words, programs, and which include, of course, DNA examinations or analyses. And she was really trying to induce me to join her, but I just couldn't see myself going to that degree. I mean, I think that it's a possibility. I mean, it's not clear to me how even with the kind of information for the kids. I mean, what lines, what you're looking. I think you have to know what you really want to look for. I mean, it's not that I wouldn't discount it. Let's put it that way. But I'm not clear about what it is that I would want to look for. I mean, I don't really. It doesn't make any. I mean, essentially, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, I told her, I said, look, I said, your grandfather and my father, I said, had green eyes. I says, it's possibly, there may have been some sort of crusader blood, I mean, that's where the crusades, these various crusades came through, from France and, Belgium, places like that. I said, and I had a cousin, a second or third cousin, who also had green eyes. I says, I don't know what all of this means, I says, if that's the kind of thing, or I says, and it may very well be that, that they're, you'll find, in other words, that, part of you is, Turkish or something like that. I said, these are not things that I really want to know. I mean, I'm not particularly interested in. I don't know what they would do for me if I knew it anyway. So, but I think that if you had a set of questions and an agenda, in other words, of questions, that you were really, looking for something really quite specific, yeah, I think it might work. Yeah.
Okay. I have a comment from Armen Marsubian, and he writes, in juxtaposition with the silences were communities of speaking. I am referencing the Armenian compatriotic unions. They gathered in regular meetings, published newsletters, and supported the publication of memoirs in the 1930s all the way to the 1960s, when most of these disappeared. I had surviving relatives who published accounts of the lost old country, and this too perhaps may be acknowledged as part of the heritage from the genocide. And here I have to say what he is also referring to is called the Hushamadian series of memory works on old abandoned towns or villages or cities that the survivors fled from.
Are these oral, basically oral recordings or reports?
No, there are oral recordings that Todd knows more about than I do at USC, of course, of survivor testimonies. But I think this particular reference is to publications in Armenian.
Yeah, I was going to say they're probably in Armenian, which
Yes.
which is not available to me. So
Okay. So I just wanted to include that for the
no, I think it's an interesting thing, and I've often wondered about that. There were, some of these things are also disputed. I wouldn't say it wasn't. I mean, some of the larger ones like Andonian's work. I mean, I don't. Isn't there a kind of controversy over that? Those reports.
There was a controversy, but I believe, it's a complicated issue. There was a well-known controversy in the 70s and 80s, but Andonian also collected a massive amount of information, of testimonies from survivors that are at the basis of Kevorkian's work and that are at the Nubarian archives.
Okay.
These are. I find it difficult to find a way of underestimating their value for reconstructing as best as a historian can the experiences of some of these witnesses.
No, I'm not disputing it. I'm just saying that I just read someplace that there had been some dispute over that, but I've never even been to that library. I've been in Paris a lot, but I've never visited the library.
So I have a quick question of my own that has to do with something more personal with you, and my interest is in knowing in what way do you connect your larger scholarship on everyday life and so on, and memory and history, as well as your scholarship on Japan in particular, to your experience growing up as a child of genocide survivors. Is there a nexus there that you could elaborate upon? Is there something specific to Japan?
Well,
is there a reason why you chose that field?
That's a really interesting question. It's a very complex question. I don't know if we haven't had much time. There was one of the reviewers of the memoir speculated, that it's because of the genocide, in other words, that I may have very well have gone as far from it as I did, which is, working on the 17th originally, but not any longer, the 17th and 18th century Japan, and I don't know about that. I think that was just part of it was I was something as dumb as I was interested I had good teachers, good undergraduate teachers, and I was, induced into kind of going to some aspect of, Asian, East Asian studies, largely because, the argument was that, there's not a lot of work done there, and, there are a lot of opportunities. I think it was a lot of it was just exaggerated, but nevertheless, as a really very young person, I mean, you take these, especially if you admire these teachers, you take them seriously. And I had very close friends, certainly, and one of my undergraduate friends who later became colleagues as well at Chicago. I mean, we were together on this, and so we ended up kind of reinforcing each other. In other words, in a decision that, sometimes, I at least have on occasions regretted making for a lot of different other reasons. As for it coming out of it has nothing to do with, it has a lot to do. The work that some of the work that I've done in Japan and my interest in other words, in thinking about how, everydayness, in other words, gets considered and must be get considered, in other words, as some form of alternative or to historical narratives. Yes, I think that stems, as I say, that particular interest stems from work that I have done and I continue to do right down to the present day. But as to my growing up, I was, I have to tell you that I would say I had no ambitions. I mean, when I think that there was a time that I wanted to be a sports writer, but I didn't know why. I mean, because I liked sports at the time, but there was nothing in my background, that I ever and rarely read anything other than magazines, sports magazines, until a certain point in life. And so it's hard to figure out, in other words. I mean, the part of it has to do with being raised in an environment, in other words, where the alternatives are really narrow and in the sense that, it's, if you come from the kind of family we come from, and, you either go into a factory or, or some menial type of work. And I had the experience working in factories, and I didn't like them, actually. And as my father once pointed out to me, he says, you don't want to work like a jackass all your life, as he did. And he was, so and what saved me, actually, and what did it for me was free colleges. I went to a junior college. I probably couldn't have gotten into a 4-year college when I graduated from high school. I was pretty low down on the list. But in where we lived, there was a junior college. And I know a number of my cohorts, some of whom were Armenian, some were Lebanese, Syrian, we all ended up in this junior college. And all of us went on to professional lives as a result of it. It was you talk about what education does at a certain moment, in other words, in a particular historical conjuncture. I mean, Wayne State was a much larger example of precisely that, because it was also filled with not just first, second generation kids from various migrant working class families, but there were also returning veterans, in other words, who were on the GI Bill. So that becomes an incredibly intense intellectual environment. And one, I don't think it's ever been replicated again. So basically, I owe at Wayne, I really did have incredibly superb teachers. I mean, they were just amazing teachers. I've never had teachers like that. I mean, graduate school was for me like a black hole. I mean, I felt like I was sitting in a black hole, in other words, for several years. But the undergraduate teaching that I got at Wayne, in many ways, got me through graduate school and into, and I still, in many ways find myself drawing upon it. So to answer your question, that's
fascinating. Thank you so much. I wish we had more time to learn more about your own life and how you became who you are. Well, but I wanted to say, I know everybody's tired by now, and especially you. So I would like to begin closing this webinar by making a few remarks in passing. So I'd like to thank, of course, our distinguished speakers, Professors Harry Harutoon and his commentator, Todd Presner, for making this event possible and providing us with a stimulating lecture and discussion. Let me close by also thanking the co-sponsors who made this possible, and also, of course, the participants who registered in large numbers to learn from this experience. My personal takeaway from Harry's life is that as the son of survivors of the genocide, he went on to graduate school through the GI Bill and so forth, and made himself into such an iconic and radiant star in the firmament of American cultural history and historiography. So I will close also by saying that I watched the verdict come in a couple of days ago on the George Floyd trial, and saw how his family, especially his sister Latonia Floyd, rejoiced when they heard that justice was not once more betrayed, but rendered partly true. Watching their reactions made me think of all those who have suffered in past genocides, and it made me wish for those who have been stigmatized by history with pain, with sorrow, revilement, and for those who have worn, as Dr. Harutoon mentioned, the scarlet letter of scorn wherever they have gone. I only wish for them to one day find the joys of justice and recognition, particularly now, and be able to repair their souls as well as those of their neighbors. So once again, thank you so much for attending this stimulating session. To repeat once more, the event is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Richard Hovhannisyan Modern Armenian History Chair at UCLA. You can find it if you receive this invitation through one of our listserv emails. You will find the link there. Otherwise, you feel free to email me. You can find my email address online, and I will be happy to direct you to that place. And so, again, it is my distinct pleasure, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this for us, Harry. And thank you again, Todd, and thank you, Bill, for making this event also possible.
Thank you for asking me.
Oh, thank you both.